Seeing means usually you open your eyes and you look to the outside world. You can see another way. You close your eyes and you look into your inner world. And I believe the best to do is to have one eye closed and to look inside, and this is the inner eye. With the other eye, you have it fixed on reality, what is going on around in the world. If you can make a kind of a synthesis of these two important words, you come to a result which can be considered as the synthesis of objective and subjective life.
This synthesis was at the heart of the Surrealist project, the twin commitments of which were to social and political, or outer revolution, and to psychic, or inner transformation. We're going to look at the relationship between the stated political commitments of the Surrealist group and examples of the art produced under its name. The term revolution appears prominently in numerous Surrealist texts, manifestos and periodicals, but rarely, if at all, is there any overt political imagery in Surrealist art.
It's obviously very striking when you go into a Surrealist exhibition that the images don't seem to have any direct connection with the political and social preoccupations of the movement. But I think that at the beginning, Surrealism had a rather generalised concept of revolt, which through the 20s sharpened into a proper sense of revolutionary commitment. And after that point, the question of a relationship between action on the social field and action as artists and poets was one of the central dilemmas of the movement. It was a dilemma which, in a sense, couldn't be resolved. I don't think Breton wanted it to be resolved. It was something that he saw as, in a way, a necessary problem.
We're going to explore this problem by examining the work of Max Ernst. Ernst was the artist most closely associated with the Surrealist group in Paris throughout the 1920s and 30s. A large retrospective exhibition of his work in London in 1991 provided an opportunity to examine his paintings and collages closely and to ask about the relationship between his paradigmatic Surrealist pictures and the social and political commitments of the group. In terms of the materials he used, the techniques he employed, and even the size of his pictures, Ernst's work is extremely varied. Some of his paintings contain vivid iconographic detail, whereas others are more atmospheric and evocative. But while varied, his work also displays numerous areas of consistency. For example, many of his works contain highly incongruous and disorienting groups of disparate objects or figures. Striking disruptions of scale often appear in the same work. Solid objects are made to appear hollowed out or flat, like cutouts. Figures are often incomplete or fragmented. For the most part, these disruptions and dislocations take place within a very rudimentary landscape space. The pictorial rectangle is used like a stage set, where we are presented with a scene frozen in its development. Many works employ a deep perspective. Others contain a simple low horizon line, which marks out the space to be occupied by a group of figures or objects in the foreground. The upper section of most works is made up of a single colour backdrop, usually a sky blue. In his painting, highlights and modelling are often very schematic. Figures are more indicated than fully described. Figures or objects are often delineated by a process of masking out the surrounding areas which, from any distance, we read as background or space. These basic structural components, then, are common to many of Ernst's works. In addition, his pictures are often populated by a regular cast of figures and types. Some of these acquired quite specific meanings for Ernst. For example, he used a male figure with a bird's head, which he called Lop Lop, as a psychoanalytic self-portrait. Birds or other animals in cages frequently feature, and are given a more general or emblematic character than may at first appear.
Breton talks about man increasingly turning round and round in a cage, like a trapped animal, that his experience is increasingly circumscribed by events, circumscribed by the need to earn a living. And all these things gradually, in fact, kill off the faculty of the imagination. And so that round about your 18th year, the imagination abandons you altogether. And from that point on, you've lost all capacity to dream, to imagine alternatives. And that, I think, is why perhaps one could come back to the point about revolution, that if you cannot imagine an alternative, then perhaps you are incapable of taking action to make it happen. And so, he would see the imagination as, in fact, crucial to the revolutionary project of the Surrealists.
Another recurrent image is the petrified forest. Ernst used this as a visual analogue of the Freudian unconscious, which Breton had often described as a labyrinth, dark, complex, and haunting.
I think that a lot of Ernst's work is in a sense about the sort of dialectic between nature and civilization. But I think that what concerned Ernst was in a way was the loss of nature, was the loss of an experience of the wild and of the primitive. And so his paintings of the petrified forest are presenting an image of a forest that has been already kind of cut down and turned into a petrified paper box. And so they are they're quite. Some of the images are quite ironic. They're about loss, and in a way they are simultaneously, I think, imbued with a very romantic spirit. Ernst had a great deal in common with the romantic tradition of his own country, but at the same time are a commentary on the loss of that romanticism.
Another series of paintings from the mid-1920s depicts a group of figures embroiled in a kind of primal struggle.
The horde paintings, retrospectively of course, seem to embody the invasion of barbarism in culture over Europe in the 1930s. And of course they were exhibited in London, in, for example, the exhibition of 20th century German art, band art, in 1938. At the same time, Peter Turner brought out this little book as a Pelican special for the masses to buy for 2 and 6pence or something, in which he said, in what an age of darkness we must live when these things have to be stated. He reproduced the horde paintings, and of course they weren't reflecting a reality, they were reflecting a nightmare reality. And he said, art can neither be praised nor blamed for holding up a mirror to the reality or dream world of an age. If this reality is chaotic, spectral and unreal, its reflection will be chaotic, spectral and unreal. I think there's a great German tradition behind Ernst, which makes, of course, this engagement with anti-fascist politics all the more poignant. One has only to think of his relationship with the painting, not only of his father, but of course the great German masters. And it's those masters that painted the German forest. One thinks especially of Altdorfer's rather sticky larch trees with black crows in them and monsters at the foot, or of Hans Baldung Green and of course of Grunewald, with those paintings specifically designed for plague victims to look at, to see in the monsters some kind of mirror of their own diseases and yet the promise of salvation. Those monsters were always painted within a context of punishment and redemption, and therefore they were moralized monsters at the time, just as Ernst's horde paintings were also not simply monstrous, but monsters bearing a moralized message about culture. Of course, while they have their iconographical sources, their unheimliche quality, their sense of eeriness is very much something to do with the monsters of the subconscious. Again, there's Freud, a modern discovery about the archaeology of the different layers of the unconscious, overlapping with primeval, much earlier images which have their cultural heritage and which Ernst brings into modernity, into the modern age, in his horde paintings.
The first manifesto talks about exploring the unconscious, exploring dreams, which were also, in a sense, a route to hidden areas of the human psyche. And Breton certainly saw these explorations as increasingly as part of a subversion of conventional modes of thinking, modes of perceiving the world, modes of acting within the world.
The image of the petrified landscape is continued in a series of highly detailed paintings made by Ernst during the 1930s and 40s.
Well, to go to Europe after the rain, what I think is particularly poignant about it is its despair in conjunction with its visionary quality, its manner of making a universal statement, and yet the very touching personal drama that is being played out by the two figures in it. There is Max Ernst as Lop-Lop with his bird head, and behind him is a figure walking away. It's very much structurally like an Orpheus and Eurydice scenario, with him almost looking back, but in fact he doesn't look back. He will go on to America. He's turning his head. And Eurydice is being abandoned and left behind and is still looking back at that Europe after the rain. Of course, what's striking about Europe after the rain, if you compare it to his jungle pictures, is that it's dead or dying. It's rock. And therefore the idea of monsters, they're not in the lush German forest, but they're the residual beasts that are left after the Holocaust. It's lizards, creatures coming out of the stones. That sense of almost a post-nuclear desolation. That's why, looking back, it seems such a prophetic thing, because Europe was shattered. One's always in art history dealing with questions of imagination. It's difficult to imagine the complexities of Ernst's political and artistic life in the 30s. It's difficult to imagine quite how desolate, bombed and unreconstructed Europe was in the 40s. And in 1942, I mean, that's the height of the bombing raids in Europe, which Ernst was aware of as he put the finishing touches to the painting. In Surrealism, there is very little explicit revolutionary content in the paintings. But if one is able to read the paintings, in particular something like Europe After the Rain, with the deep context of the time, you see how very rich and poignant some of these non-political images are.
So far, we've looked at a range of Ernst's imagery in relation to the Surrealist concept of revolution. But we need also to look at the techniques Ernst used to generate this imagery. In the first manifesto, Breton indicated that forms of automatism would be the central methods of Surrealist production. Automatic writing and other forms of free association had been developed by Freud in the treatment of his patients. He believed they could reveal aspects of the subject's unconscious mental activity.
There were several techniques that Surrealist artists invented to, as part of their search for an equivalent to automatic writing, which had been announced as the kind of primary the primary research tool, if you like, of the Surrealists. And Max Ernst devised frottage and grattage. Grattage was a technique of applying paint in layers to the canvas and then scraping it off over a textured surface. And some of the images that are produced in those paintings hover between being, as it were, simply a texture. I mean, really, whose interest is a very, very visual one, and so embedded behind it a recognisable image of a cityscape or a forest. In some of the paintings of the forests, or sometimes the forests themselves, the trees are actually grattages of planks of wood. So you have, I mean, as it were, in the substance, the material of the paint, you have a reference to the forest already cut down.
Collage was another important technique. Ernst had first used it while working with the Dada group in Cologne during World War I.
Obviously, collage has, I suppose, to be the outcome of a set of conscious procedures to an extent. Ernst himself got around this by explaining that some of the collages, which aren't literally collages in some cases, which are engravings or photographs, which he's altered by the addition of a spot of paint or a line here and there, that he explained that some of them he arrived at these deformations or alterations by flicking very fast through the pages of a catalogue or of a geology textbook or a biology textbook, and that he would find by doing this conjunctions of things that were totally irrational, but which in some sense hooked him, that he was fascinated by these conjunctions. Now, Ernst's collages date from 1919, 1920, 21, the first set of collages, which were then exhibited in Paris in 1921. And they had a very profound effect on the Surrealists. They had a profound effect on the future Surrealists, who recognised in them, I think, an equivalent to a poetic procedure, which the Surrealists always, in a sense, acknowledged in the work of Lautréamont, which was the bringing together of two or more dissimilar realities on a plane which was foreign to all of them, and providing from this a spark. And in a sense, this spark was, Breton used this sort of electrical image, but this spark was what he saw as, what he described as the Surrealist light. I mean, something which would actually illuminate, but disorient the viewer. I mean, illuminate the world through disorientation. I'm not saying necessarily that Ernst was familiar at this point with Le Traitement, but that this notion of bringing together unlikely things was at the heart of his concept of collage as well. I think crucial to these collages is the notion of disorientation, that you may have a landscape, for example, but the landscape contains elements that must be foreign to it, and it contains objects within that which are foreign to the landscape and to each other. And so you have a world, if you like, an image which could only exist as a consequence of an imaginative reordering of the world. Now, this imaginative reordering was something that Breton felt could only occur through unconscious procedures. Others have argued that it could be done consciously, but for Breton this was something that could only be done in a sense without your realising it was being done. If you knew it was being done, it was cliché. And he uses it, he says at one point, the first poet who said lips of coral was a surrealist, and the second one was a hack.
Europe After the Rain was made using a production process which Ernst had termed decalcomania.
The technique of decalcomania is a typical technique in terms of it being semi-automatic. It's done by putting glass or a sheet of paper onto the surface and pulling it away. So you get this sticky kind of surface. And then, though, one thinks that's all there is to it. Surrealism, automatism is always a cheat. Then Ernst comes and turns that sticky texture into a geological map full of monsters and fossils. Another lovely thing about decalcomania is not just the way it's painted, but the way that one has to look into it to see oneself, whether there's a painted face in the rock or whether one is imagining the face in the rock. And so there's always this rather creepy sense of potential monsters in it, as well as those which, in time-honoured German tradition, Ernst carefully painted.
It's in these techniques, then, as well as in his imagery, that Ernst sought to generate material which would bear on both social and psychological reality. Revolution, for the Surrealists, was always understood as involving a synthesis of these two realities, the outer and the inner worlds, as Ernst put it.
The word révolution for them meant two very distinct things. It meant the Marxist revolution, and in particular the Soviet revolution in Russia, with all that that entailed, i.e. complete restructuring of society, the revolution of the proletariat, the abolition of capitalism, on the one hand. On the other hand, it meant the revolution in personal behaviour and understanding of human beings as posited by Freud.
It was very much a group to which you had to be admitted. It wasn't something you would just choose to join if you felt like it. It was a kind of collective, but it was a collective with a rather exclusive membership, which definitely thought of itself as being a group who were committed on every level to the revolution, social level and at the artistic level. But they had no illusions about themselves as active politicians. They could be militant on the fringes, if you like. They were very good at producing pamphlets attacking Catholicism. There were certain areas they felt were areas on which they had the right to speak, and that was certainly one of them. They attacked the Catholic Church. But they didn't pretend that they were well endowed to enter Parliament, for example. But I think they saw themselves as being able to carry on the fight in certain ways.
I was born with a very strong feeling of need of freedom, liberty. Mm-hmm. And that means also with a very strong feeling of revolt. Mm. Revolt and revolution is not the same thing. But when you have this very strong feeling of this need of revolt, need of freedom, and you are born into a period where so many events invite you to get revolted and throw over what is going on in the world and be disgusted with it and so on. It is absolutely natural that the work you produce is a revolutionary work. Yes. So there is again the inner world and the outer world work together to make out of me a revolutionary painter.